When a young girl decides to stand up against the old traditions of Hollow Creek, she faces anger and resistance from her community. Her fight for justice reveals the hidden truths of the town and forces her to make difficult choices. In a place that fears change, her courage could bring hope or lead to great loss. In the small, quiet town of Hollow Creek, history wasn't just a part of the past. It was alive in every corner, in every building, and in the very air people breathed. Hollow Creek had its own set of unwritten rules that everyone followed, rules that had been passed down for generations. It was a place where tradition meant everything, and those who didn't fit within the established norms often found themselves struggling to find a place. The town's identity was shaped by the old ways, ways that had long kept things the same, untouched by time. At 17, Lily Thornton was already aware that she didn't fully belong in Hollow Creek. Raised by her grandmother, Mabel Thornton, Lily had always been a top student, a bright young woman with dreams that stretched far beyond the borders of her small town. While the rest of Hollow Creek seemed content with the life it had always known, Lily was determined to forge a path of her own. She dreamed of going to college, leaving the town behind, and creating a future where she could break free from the constraints that her small town had placed on her. But Hollow Creek wasn't a place where dreams like Lily's were easily accepted. Its traditions were woven into the very fabric of life, and any attempt to challenge them was met with resistance. It was a place where people rarely questioned the status quo, where loyalty to the town's unwritten rules was valued above all else. It was a place where change came slowly, if at all. The tensions in Hollow Creek were further complicated by the growing divide between the rich and the working class, as well as by the deep-rooted issues of race and privilege. Despite its picturesque charm, Hollow Creek was a town where some voices were louder than others, where certain people were given more opportunities, and others were pushed to the margins. This divide became painfully clear when Joe Calhoun, a hardworking local farmer, was accused of a serious crime. Joe Calhoun was well known in Hollow Creek, not for his wealth or influence, but for his tireless work ethic. He was a black man living in a town where race still mattered in ways that many preferred not to acknowledge. Joe's family had worked the same land for generations, but despite their hard work and contribution to the community, they were still seen as outsiders, always on the edges of the town's social life. When Joe was accused of committing a crime, the town erupted. It was an accusation that struck at the heart of Hollow Creek's long-standing racial tensions. The very nature of the crime, an allegation that pitted a local black man against a prominent white family, shook the town to its core. Joe Calhoun was now at the center of a storm that threatened to reveal just how divided Hollow Creek really was. Many people in the town were quick to believe the worst about Joe, and the whispers grew louder, spreading rumors and fueling fears. It was easy for people to believe the worst about someone who had never been fully accepted by the town. In the midst of this growing controversy stood Henry Thornton, Lily's uncle and a well-respected lawyer in Hollow Creek. Henry was known for his sharp legal mind and his dedication to upholding the law. He had spent his career representing the town's wealthiest families, ensuring that the legal system remained in their favor. But when the opportunity arose to defend Joe Calhoun, Henry faced a difficult choice. He could continue to play it safe, maintaining his standing in Hollow Creek, or he could take a stand for what he believed was right, regardless of the consequences. Henry chose the latter. He decided to defend Joe Calhoun, even though he knew it would cost him. The townspeople who had once respected him were now skeptical of his decision. The pressure from his peers was immense. The case was already seen as controversial, and Henry's involvement would certainly bring him into conflict with those who had always supported him. The defense of Joe would mean risking his career, his reputation, and the trust of the community he had always served. For Lily, her uncle's decision was both a challenge and an opportunity. She had always admired Henry for his dedication to justice, for his belief that the law should be fair and impartial. But now, as the town rallied against her uncle, Lily found herself torn. She had always been taught to follow the rules, to respect the traditions of Hollow Creek, but the defense of Joe Calhoun was an opportunity to challenge those very rules. It was a chance to fight for what was right, even when the world around her seemed determined to maintain the status quo. At first, Lily struggled with her own feelings. The town was in turmoil, and her involvement in her uncle's defense would surely draw criticism. Her friends at school, her neighbors, and even her family would not understand why she was standing by her uncle's side. Mabel, her grandmother, was particularly concerned. She feared that Lily's involvement would bring shame to their family, that it would mark them as outsiders in a town that valued loyalty to its traditions above all else. But Lily was determined. She realized that this was her chance to stand for something bigger than herself, something more important than the small-town ideals she had always known. She knew that standing by her uncle's side, supporting his decision to defend Joe, would not be easy. It would mean facing the criticism of her classmates, the disapproval of her family, and the cold stares of the people she had once called friends. But Lily felt that it was worth the cost. She knew that, in the end, standing up for what was right was more important than fitting in. As the trial began, tensions reached a boiling point in Hollow Creek. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. On one side were those who believed in Joe's guilt, convinced by the rumors that had circulated about him. On the other side were those who saw the trial as an opportunity to challenge the town's ingrained prejudices and demand that justice be done. But as the evidence came to light, it became clear that the case against Joe was not as solid as it seemed. The allegations against him were based more on assumptions than on facts, and the truth about what had happened was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Despite the growing evidence that Joe was innocent, the town's deep-seated racial biases were too strong to overcome. The jury, composed of people who had lived in Hollow Creek their entire lives, could not bring themselves to challenge the traditions that had always governed their lives. In the end, Joe Calhoun was convicted, not because the evidence supported it, but because the town was unwilling to break free from the old ways. For Lily, the trial was a turning point. She had seen firsthand how deeply entrenched the town's prejudices were. She had witnessed how difficult it was for people to challenge their beliefs, even when the truth was staring them in the face. But despite the injustice of the verdict, Lily also saw something else. She saw the possibility for change. She saw that there were people in Hollow Creek who were ready to break free from the old ways, who were ready to fight for a more just future. As the trial ended and the town slowly began to settle back into its routines, Lily found herself more determined than ever to leave Hollow Creek behind. But now, she didn't just want to escape the town's stifling traditions, she wanted to change them. She knew that her dream of going to college and building a life of her own was still possible, but she also knew that it would take more than just leaving Hollow Creek behind. It would take courage, determination, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. In the end, Lily's journey was not just about leaving Hollow Creek, it was about transforming it. She had taken a stand, alongside her uncle, for justice. And though the town might never fully embrace change, Lily knew that she had done the right thing. She had made her own path, and in doing so, had planted the seeds for a future where the old traditions would no longer hold power over the lives of those who lived in Hollow Creek. The days leading up to the trial were tense in Hollow Creek. News of Joe Calhoun's arrest had spread like wildfire, and the town, long divided by race and class, was now splitting at the seams. On one side, there were those who believed Joe's guilt without question, bolstered by the centuries-old racial prejudices that shaped their worldview. On the other side, there were the few who saw a glimmer of justice, people like Lily Thornton and her uncle, Henry Thornton, who believed in fairness, even if it meant going against the tide. As the trial began, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. It was a small, tight-knit town, and everyone had an opinion, whether they had seen the evidence or not. Hollow Creek, with its centuries-old customs and traditions, was not prepared for a case like this. In a town where the races had been divided for generations, the accusation alone had created a chasm that could never be bridged without deep emotional scars. Lily sat in the front row of the courtroom, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on her. The wooden pews creaked as the townspeople filed in, murmuring among themselves. Her Uncle Henry sat at the defense table, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the pressure that had built up inside him. This was more than just a trial for justice. It was a trial for the very soul of Hollow Creek. At first, Lily struggled with her own feelings. The town was in turmoil, and her involvement in her uncle's defense would surely draw criticism. Her friends at school, her neighbors, and even her family would not understand why she was standing by her uncle's side. Mabel, her grandmother, was particularly concerned. She feared that Lily's involvement would bring shame to their family, that it would mark them as outsiders in a town that valued loyalty to its traditions above all else. But Lily was determined. She realized that this was her chance to stand for something bigger than herself, something more important than the small-town ideals she had always known. She knew that standing by her uncle's side, supporting his decision to defend Joe, would not be easy. It would mean facing the criticism of her classmates, the disapproval of her family, and the cold stares of the people she had once called friends. But Lily felt that it was worth the cost. She knew that, in the end, standing up for what was right was more important than fitting in. As the trial began, tensions reached a boiling point in Hollow Creek. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. On one side were those who believed in Joe's guilt, convinced by the rumors that had circulated about him. On the other side were those who saw the trial as an opportunity to challenge the town's ingrained prejudices and demand that justice be done. But as the evidence came to light, it became clear that the case against Joe was not as solid as it seemed. The allegations against him were based more on assumptions than on facts, and the truth about what had happened was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Despite the growing evidence that Joe was innocent, the town's deep-seated racial biases were too strong to overcome. The jury, composed of people who had lived in Hollow Creek their entire lives, could not bring themselves to challenge the traditions that had always governed their lives. In the end, Joe Calhoun was convicted, not because the evidence supported it, but because the town was unwilling to break free from the old ways. For Lily, the trial was a turning point. She had seen firsthand how deeply entrenched the town's prejudices were. She had witnessed how difficult it was for people to challenge their beliefs, even when the truth was staring them in the face. But, despite the injustice of the verdict, Lily also saw something else. She saw the possibility for change. She saw that there were people in Hollow Creek who were ready to break free from the old ways, who were ready to fight for a more just future. As the trial ended and the town slowly began to settle back into its routines, Lily found herself more determined than ever to leave Hollow Creek behind. But now, she didn't just want to escape the town's stifling traditions, she wanted to change them. She knew that her dream of going to college and building a life of her own was still possible, but she also knew that it would take more than just leaving Hollow Creek behind. It would take courage, determination, and the willingness to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. In the end, Lily's journey was not just about leaving Hollow Creek, it was about transforming it. She had taken a stand, alongside her uncle, for justice. And though the town might never fully embrace change, Lily knew that she had done the right thing. She had made her own path, and in doing so, had planted the seeds for a future where the old traditions would no longer hold power over the lives of those who lived in Hollow Creek. The days leading up to the trial were tense in Hollow Creek. News of Joe Calhoun's arrest had spread like wildfire, and the town, long divided by race and class, was now splitting at the seams. On one side there were those who believed Joe's guilt without question, bolstered by the centuries-old racial prejudices that shaped their worldview. On the other side, there were the few who saw a glimmer of justice, people like Lily Thornton and her uncle Henry Thornton, who believed in fairness, even if it meant going against the tide. As the trial began, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. It was a small, tight-knit town, and everyone had an opinion, whether they had seen the evidence or not. Hollow Creek, with its centuries-old customs and traditions, was not prepared for a case like this. In a town where the races had been divided for generations, the accusation alone had created a chasm that could never be bridged without deep emotional scars. Lily sat in the front row of the courtroom, feeling the weight of the room pressing down on her. The wooden pews creaked as the townspeople filed in, murmuring among themselves. Her Uncle Henry sat at the defense table, his expression calm but his eyes betraying the pressure that had built up inside him. This was more than just a trial for justice. It was a trial for the very soul of Hollow Creek. As the prosecution's opening statement rang out, Lily could feel the eyes of the town on her. Many of the people in the room had known her for years. Some had even watched her grow up, seen her as the perfect example of the town's values: obedient, respectful, dutiful. But now, in this moment, Lily knew she had chosen a different path. Her decision to support Joe Calhoun, to stand by her uncle, had made her a target. But she couldn't back down now. She had come this far. The prosecution painted Joe Calhoun as a predator, a man who had taken advantage of Sarah Jenkins, the daughter of one of Hollow Creek's wealthiest families. The case was framed in black and white terms. Joe, the outsider, had violated the sacred trust of the town. It was a narrative that played well with the jury, a story that fit perfectly into the racial prejudices many people in Hollow Creek held. There was no question in their minds that Joe was guilty. The fact that Sarah Jenkins was a young, respected member of the town's elite only added weight to the accusation. But Henry Thornton, with his calm demeanor and sharp legal mind, knew better than to accept things at face value. He had been a lawyer in Hollow Creek for years, seen countless trials unfold, and he knew that justice could not be decided based on assumptions or biases. He knew that the truth had to be sought, no matter how uncomfortable it made people feel. The defense presented their case methodically, peeling back the layers of the accusation against Joe. Witnesses were called, each of them testifying to Joe's character. His neighbors spoke of his hard work, his quiet dignity, and the way he had always kept to himself. They testified to his kindness, the way he had helped those in need without asking for anything in return. Joe had been a part of Hollow Creek for years, and while some people had never fully accepted him because of his race, many others knew that he was a man of integrity. The defense also called attention to the lack of physical evidence in the case. There were no signs of force, no marks, no bruises that could substantiate Sarah Jenkins' claims. And yet, despite the absence of any concrete evidence, the accusation had become fact in the eyes of the town. Lily, sitting silently in the courtroom, watched as the truth slowly began to emerge. The more the defense spoke, the more she realized how much the town had ignored. Hollow Creek had long been a place where people were judged by the color of their skin, where the voices of the marginalized were easily silenced, and where tradition held more weight than truth. The revelation came during the testimony of Sarah Jenkins herself. As she took the stand, her hands trembled, her eyes avoiding the gaze of the jury. She had been the perfect example of the town's ideal, beautiful, white, and wealthy, and her words had been trusted without question. But as she spoke, her story began to fall apart. Her account of the events was inconsistent, her details contradictory, and it became clear that there were things she wasn't telling the jury. The most crucial moment came when it was revealed that Sarah had been having a relationship with a young man from a neighboring town. The defense didn't outright accuse her of lying, but they carefully pointed out the discrepancies in her story. She had been hiding the truth, and the more she tried to defend her accusation, the more her credibility eroded. For Lily, watching this unravel was both a relief and a sorrow. She had hoped that Joe was innocent, but she had never imagined that the truth would come out in this way, through a young woman's own unraveling. But as the pieces fell into place, Lily saw the painful reality of the world she lived in. The truth, no matter how much it was needed, was often the hardest thing to accept, especially when it challenged the very foundation of what a community believed. The trial came to an end, and the jury deliberated. Lily sat in the courtroom, feeling a mixture of hope and dread. She knew that the truth had been exposed, But in Hollow Creek, the truth often wasn't enough to overcome years of prejudice and tradition. She had seen it before, how people clung to their beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Would the jury see the truth for what it was, or would they protect the reputation of a family like the Jenkinses, whose wealth and status were woven into the fabric of the town? The verdict came as no surprise. Joe Calhoun was convicted. The jury, despite all the evidence, still found him guilty. The reasons for the verdict were unspoken but clear. Hollow Creek was not ready to confront the reality of its own biases. It wasn't ready to accept that, despite the evidence, race and social standing still influenced every decision made in the town. In the end, Joe was seen not as an individual, but as a symbol of everything the town feared and resented. For Lily, the verdict was a painful blow. She had hoped for a different outcome, but deep down she had known that change would not come easily. It would take time, and it would take more than just one trial to dismantle the entrenched racism that had existed in Hollow Creek for generations. But in that moment, as she looked around the courtroom and saw the faces of the people who had so easily accepted the verdict, Lily understood that the battle for justice was far from over. Her uncle, Henry, stood by Joe's side as the verdict was read, his face impassive but his eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. He had fought for what was right, but the town had not been ready for that fight. The road ahead would be long, and Henry knew that there would be no easy way to bring about change in Hollow Creek. But for Lily, the trial was a turning point. She had seen the truth, and she had fought for it. She had learned that standing up for what was right wasn't always easy, and it didn't always lead to immediate victory. But it was still worth fighting for. And though Hollow Creek had rejected the truth in this trial, Lily was determined to keep fighting. For Joe, for justice, and for the future she still believed was possible. As the trial ended, and the town began to return to its normal rhythm, Lily knew one thing for certain. She couldn't walk away from this fight. No matter what, she would continue to challenge the traditions of Hollow Creek. She would stand up for the marginalized, for the voiceless, and for the truth, because the future of Hollow Creek depended on it. The days following the verdict were heavy in Hollow Creek. The air seemed thicker, suffocating under the weight of an undeniable injustice. Despite the trial's clear revelations, the town had made its decision, and the truth seemed powerless against the unyielding grasp of tradition. The streets of Hollow Creek, once familiar and safe, now felt like a battleground where ideals clashed and the quiet hum of everyday life was interrupted by whispered conversations and cold stares. Lily could no longer deny the changes within her. The trial, the evidence, and the town's reaction had opened her eyes to the deep-rooted prejudices that shaped Hollow Creek's very identity. The injustice Joe Calhoun had suffered was not just a personal tragedy. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the town. The divide between the wealthy, the white, and the marginalized, the black, was more than just a matter of skin. It was about power, control, and the ability to dictate the truth. Lily sat on the porch of her grandmother's house one evening, watching the sun sink below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the land. The peacefulness of the moment only heightened her internal conflict. She had always known that Hollow Creek wasn't perfect, but now she saw the cracks that ran deep beneath the surface, cracks that couldn't be ignored any longer. Her Uncle Henry had been silent in the days since the trial. His integrity had been questioned, his moral compass tested, and the weight of his decision to defend Joe Calhoun seemed to have taken its toll. He had risked everything: his career, his standing in the community, his reputation, and yet the town had rejected him, rejected the truth. For Lily, it was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Henry had done the right thing, even when it had cost him everything. He had stood up for justice, and now it was up to Lily to decide what role she would play in this new reality. "Are you okay, Lily?" Her grandmother's voice broke through her thoughts. Mabel stood in the doorway, her gaze searching Lily's face for any hint of the young girl who had been full of dreams and idealism just weeks before. Lily didn't immediately answer. She didn't know how to explain everything that was swirling in her mind. "I don't know, Grandma," she finally said, her voice tinged with frustration. "I thought I understood this place. I thought I knew what people were capable of, but after the trial, it's like everything has changed. The town, the people, they didn't care about the truth." Mabel nodded, her expression softening with understanding. "It's not easy, Lily. Sometimes the truth is the hardest thing to accept. Hollow Creek is a place steeped in tradition, and those traditions can make people blind to what's right in front of them. It's always been that way." Lily shook her head, her fists clenching in anger. "But that's the problem, Grandma. People are too scared to see things differently. They've spent their whole lives holding on to these old ways, and when something happens that forces them to confront their own prejudices, they refuse to look." "I know," Mabel said softly. "But you've got to understand, change doesn't come easy. It never has. It'll take time, and it'll take people like you to keep pushing for it. You're young, Lily. You have a voice, and you can make a difference. But it's not going to be quick, and it won't always be easy." Lily's thoughts swirled with uncertainty, but something inside her clicked. She had been raised to respect tradition, to be obedient, to follow the rules. But those rules had failed Joe Calhoun, and they had failed Hollow Creek. The truth could no longer be ignored. The town needed change, whether it wanted it or not. "I can't just stand by and do nothing," Lily finally said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I have to do something." Mabel looked at her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "Just remember, change is a long road, Lily. It won't be easy, but if you believe in it, if you believe in what's right, then you have to keep fighting, even if it feels like the world is against you." The weeks after the trial passed in a blur of tension and discomfort. Hollow Creek had returned to its routine, but it was different now. Tense, fractured, and more aware of its flaws than ever before. The injustice done to Joe Calhoun still weighed heavily on the community, but rather than acknowledge it, most people chose to go back to the familiar comforts of denial. Yet, in the quiet moments, when Lily sat alone and thought about what had happened, she knew she couldn't let the world go back to what it was. Joe Calhoun's conviction wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a much larger issue, one that needed to be addressed if Hollow Creek ever had a chance of moving forward. She knew that if she remained silent, if she allowed this injustice to fade into the background, then she would be complicit in it. With her Uncle Henry's encouragement, Lily began to speak out. She didn't have the legal training he did, but she had something that he couldn't offer: youth, passion, and a voice that had the power to reach others in the community. At first, it wasn't easy. Her words were met with resistance, with the same stubbornness that had characterized Hollow Creek for generations. People didn't want to hear her talk about change. They didn't want to hear about justice when it threatened their comfortable worldview. But slowly, Lily's voice found an audience. She started small, talking to her friends at school, the people she trusted. She began writing letters to the local paper, speaking out about the flaws in the justice system and calling for a change in the way Hollow Creek treated its most marginalized citizens. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She knew that change would come slowly, but she also knew that every small voice mattered. Through her words and her actions, Lily began to ignite a spark. Some people, like Reggie Collins, her rebellious friend, stood by her side, pushing her to keep going even when things seemed hopeless. Reggie had always been the voice of dissent, the one who questioned everything, and his support was invaluable. But it wasn't just the younger generation that was taking notice. Slowly, there were others in Hollow Creek, adults, community leaders, who began to see the flaws in the system. They started to question the status quo, to ask hard questions about race and justice, and what it meant to live in a town so divided by history. It was slow, painful work, but it was happening. The turning point came one evening when Lily stood before a local meeting of town leaders. She had written a speech, one that outlined the injustice done to Joe Calhoun and the larger issue of racial inequality in Hollow Creek. She was nervous, her hands shaking as she took the microphone, but as she looked out into the crowd, she saw familiar faces. People who had once looked at her with scorn. People who now looked at her with curiosity. With every word, Lily spoke not just for Joe, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, ignored, or oppressed in Hollow Creek. The words she spoke were not just about the past. They were about the future, about what Hollow Creek could become if it embraced change. By the end of her speech, there was silence in the room, a heavy silence that spoke volumes. It wasn't a cheer, it wasn't applause, but it was the beginning of something. Lily had planted a seed. It would take time, it would take persistence, and it would take a collective effort, but the tide had started to turn. Hollow Creek, for all its traditions and history, was slowly beginning to change. And Lily Thornton, once a young girl torn between the old ways and the new, had become the voice that would lead the way forward. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, Lily's commitment to justice only deepened. She had planted the seed of change in Hollow Creek, but like any seed, it needed time to grow. The community was divided, as it had always been, between those who clung to the past and those who were ready to embrace something new. But despite the resistance, there was a palpable shift in the air, a quiet stirring, a murmur of discontent that grew louder with each passing day. For Lily, the work had only just begun. She knew that one speech, one letter, or one act of defiance wasn't enough to change the deeply ingrained attitudes of a town that had existed in the same way for generations. It wasn't just about Joe Calhoun or the injustice done to him. It was about the very structure of the town itself. It was about how Hollow Creek treated its marginalized citizens, how it turned a blind eye to systemic inequality, and how it needed to confront its own history in order to move forward. Lily continued to work alongside her Uncle Henry, who had become her mentor and guide. He had always been the voice of reason in their family, the one who had taught her that justice was not just about winning cases, it was about doing what was right, even when it was hard. But even Henry, despite his years of experience, had learned something from his niece. Lily's unwavering idealism had rekindled his own belief that things could change, that people could change, if only they were willing to try. Henry's legal practice had taken a hit after the trial, but he was determined to continue fighting for justice. He represented clients who had been wronged by the system, people who had been overlooked and forgotten. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always popular, but Henry believed in the law, and he believed that it could be a force for good, even in a town like Hollow Creek. Lily's role in this new chapter was equally important. She became an advocate for social change, not just through speeches and letters, but through action. She organized community meetings, brought together people from different walks of life, and started conversations about race, privilege, and inequality. Some of the older, more traditional families were skeptical, but there were others, farmers, teachers, small business owners, who were beginning to ask the hard questions. Her friendship with Reggie Collins grew stronger as they worked together. Reggie was the perfect foil to Lily's determination. Where Lily was idealistic, Reggie was pragmatic, always asking how instead of why. He pushed Lily to think beyond the immediate struggles, to consider the long-term impact of their work. Together, they began to map out a plan for engaging the town's youth, getting them involved in community-building projects, and creating spaces where young people could speak out against the injustices they had witnessed in Hollow Creek. One of the most impactful changes was the creation of a youth-led coalition dedicated to social justice. It wasn't a big group at first, just a handful of passionate teenagers and young adults who believed in a better future. But with Lily at the helm, the coalition quickly gained momentum. They held rallies, distributed literature, and spoke out at town meetings. Slowly, more and more young people in the town began to join, and soon Hollow Creek had a new generation of leaders who were committed to fighting for equality. Despite the progress, the road was still long and fraught with obstacles. There were still powerful figures in the town who resisted change, those who clung to their privilege and their place in the social order. Many of them had been raised to believe that the way things had always been was the way they were meant to be. They didn't understand why things needed to change, or if they did, they feared the unknown. Lily's family was torn. Her grandmother Mabel, despite her deep love for Lily, still held on to some of the old beliefs that had shaped her life. Mabel was proud of her granddaughter's determination, but she also feared the backlash that came with challenging the status quo. She had lived through times when change was dangerous, when it could tear families apart and destroy entire communities. It wasn't that she didn't care about justice, it was that she didn't want to see Lily hurt in the process. At times, Lily felt isolated, unsure of her place in a community that was both her home and the source of her frustration. But then, she would think of Joe Calhoun, the man whose life had been forever altered by the town's deep-seated prejudices. She remembered his quiet dignity during the trial, his courage in the face of injustice. She thought about the way he had trusted her Uncle Henry and the way the system had failed him, and she realized that this fight was bigger than her personal struggles. It was about making sure that the next Joe Calhoun didn't have to face the same fate. Months passed, and Hollow Creek began to see small victories, changes that couldn't be ignored. A new community center was established, where people of all races and backgrounds could come together and work on local projects. The Youth Coalition, with Lily at its core, spearheaded initiatives to bring awareness to social issues that had long been brushed aside. They held forums on race relations, brought in guest speakers from diverse backgrounds, and organized volunteer efforts to help those who had been marginalized. But the most significant change came when a new mayoral election was held. After years of being run by the same conservative officials, Hollow Creek found itself at a crossroads. The election was heated, with both old guard candidates and new, progressive voices vying for power. Lily and her allies threw their support behind a candidate who had long fought for racial justice and equality, a man who had been on the front lines of the fight for change in the town. The campaign was contentious, with heated debates and accusations flying in every direction. But in the end, James Carter, a longtime community organizer who had worked with both black and white residents of Hollow Creek, won the election by a slim margin. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of things, but it was a victory nonetheless, a sign that the people of Hollow Creek were ready for change, even if it was uncomfortable. As the election results were announced, Lily stood at the front of a crowd that was both jubilant and cautious. She could hear the whispers of doubt from some, the resistance from others, but she also felt the excitement of those who saw this as the beginning of something new. In that moment, Lily realized that change wasn't always immediate. Sometimes it was slow, it was messy, and it was filled with setbacks. But it was happening, one step at a time. As Hollow Creek began its slow transformation, Lily looked back at the person she had been when she first started this journey, the young girl who had dreamed of leaving the town, escaping its stifling traditions and prejudices. Now, she understood that her place was here, in Hollow Creek, fighting for the change she had once thought impossible. Lily had learned that the fight for justice wasn't about one big victory or a single moment of triumph. It was about persistence, about speaking the truth even when it was unpopular, and about building relationships with people who were willing to listen, even if they didn't always agree. She had learned that change was a collective effort, that it took the courage of many to make a difference. She looked out at the town she had grown up in, the place that had shaped her into who she was, and for the first time she saw a future where justice, equality, and hope were more than just words. They were the foundation of a new Hollow Creek. The road ahead was long, and the fight was far from over. But for Lily Thornton, the journey had only just begun. As Lily stood on the steps of her grandmother's house looking out over Hollow Creek, the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm, golden light across the land. In that quiet moment, she felt the weight of everything that had led her here, the struggles, the sacrifices, the doubt, and the hope. Hollow Creek, for all its flaws, was her home, and for the first time she truly believed that the town had the potential to be better. It wasn't an easy road. Change never is. It's slow, often painful, and met with resistance at every turn. but the seeds of change that had been planted in the soil of Hollow Creek had begun to take root. They had sprouted in the hearts of young people who had learned to question the status quo, in the eyes of community leaders who were beginning to listen, and in the courage of a few who dared to stand up for what was right. Lily had learned something fundamental in this journey. Change begins with individuals, but it's only realized when a community comes together. It's about more than just challenging the past. It's about reshaping the future, creating a world where justice, equality, and compassion are not just ideals, but lived realities. The battle for change is ongoing, and the future of Hollow Creek is still unwritten. But Lily now knows that every step, every conversation, every act of defiance counts. She knows that as long as people continue to stand up, continue to speak out, and continue to believe in the possibility of a better world, progress will happen. If you believe in change, start with yourself. Like, share, and subscribe to be part of the movement towards a better future.